He came to me long past moonrise. Glaric, a relative newcomer to a village where newcomers are so rare as to be non-existent. 5 years he lived among us and still wore the label of neophyte. He kept to himself, worked a small patch of land, dug for turnips and beets, plucked wild mushrooms from the lower elevations. I knew him enough to nod at him in the market, nothing more. And so, I was astonished when I obeyed the midnight rap at my door to behold Glaric, his unshaven cheeks sallow and hollow, his grey eyes red-rimmed and fear-fissured. I expected to detect a reek of honeyed mead upon his breath when he spoke, but to my surprise I smelled it not. "I must come in," he said to me, his tone urgent and too familiar, presuming much on what was not even acquaintanceship. 6 hours till daylight, I told him. "I'll see you then." "No! Now!" I stood athwart the door, uselessly, for he nimbly evaded my outstretched limbs and slipped into my hut, silent, ghost-like, treadless. "I need a man of letters," he said, gazing around my abode, taking in my shelves and scrolls and tomes, meticulously and assiduously gathered over the decades. "I need someone who can write. Here, this means only you." Sighing, I closed the door against the chill of night. "I was about to retire," I informed him. "On the morrow I would be happy to write whatever letter or complaint you—" "No letter," he said courtly, wheeling about to glare at me with those wild crimson-webbed eyes. "And no complaint. We are all going to die. There is nothing for it. But something must be left behind. A testimony. A warning." "All men die," I agreed. "But not now." "Have you smelled it?" he asked. His smile both crooked and haunted. A mirthless thing it was. "Smelled what?" I replied. "The air," I allowed, as how the air had taken on an unfamiliar savor recently. An almost pleasant tang that lingered in the cavities behind the nose just long enough to promise something, and then dissipation. "Salt air," he said. "Smell of the ocean." The ocean? 100 miles distant if afoot, to say nothing of the elevation. His comment wrested a chuckle from me, a laugh cut short by the brute seriousness of his gaze. "I have smelt the ocean," I told him. "I've never been, but I feel safe in saying that the ocean is too far. The ocean is coming. Here. And thus, a testimony." He paced before dying embers of my fireplace, restless and trembling, like some creature both predator and prey. "A warning to others. Soon we will all be gone. You must take it down. My story, my history, my pride and my pain. All of it." I no longer hungered for sleep. I smelled again the strangeness in the air, as though the mere mentioning of it aloud had caused the scent to return. Could it truly be the ocean, even here? 'Twas likely I would not recognize the scent of the sea, regardless. I had lived my entire life within a hand's span of the clouds, high atop the mountains that tower over the dry steppes. Save for the youthful years I spent in the city, training in letters, and now, among the goatherds and shepherds and the scrambling farmers. My library is the field and the sky, the animals and their studied behaviors my laboratory. I am content here. I am known. I have nothing to fear. Nothing. And nothing would change that. Least of all Galric's dilated pupils and manic gesturing. Still, to placate and assuage, and perhaps out of my own curiosity. Without another word, I sat at my desk, gathering to me foolscap and my writing implements. I bade him to join me at a chair nearby, but he shook away my offer with a physical vehemence similar to that of a rain-drenched wolf, standing instead where he could watch the fire, and occasionally prod the logs into sparks and crackles with the poker. And then he spoke. He spoke of the sea and of a listening temple and of some things that arose from the black and brackish waters. Once he began his story, the words flowed from him like the waters of which he spoke, without turning to me, without looking, without preamble, and without surcease. I dipped quill to ink, set ink to paper, to recount this tale as it was told to me. I have captured here faithfully what he told me, in his words, not mine, and I promise only one thing: once read, whether you believe his tale or not, you will forget me and my small part in this, but remember only him, and, I pray, his warning. I am Glaric, Glaric of the Glades, Glaric Lightfinger, Glaric Swapcloth, Nimble Glaric, and more. And more they called me in the city, in my time, when I was a younger man. I never did learn how to read, how to make my letters, never needed it. I learned all I needed to know with my hands, flesh enough to pluck out any purse or wallet I could want, and my feet, fleet enough to run from the law. If there was something in the city someone wanted and couldn't have, they could have it from me, for the right clink of coin in my palm. And then there were things I took just because I could. The city guards came to know my face. They knew my guilt too, but couldn't prove it to the satisfaction of a magistrate. I've said enough, maybe. Maybe I've said enough about all that, except this. I robbed the local Horadric archive once. Got paid to take a bauble. Took more in one of my troubles, and that. I'd stolen from barons and earls, duchesses, and even a princess once. But nothing brought the fires of the law on me like that job. You'd think I'd snitched Cheriel's wings right off his back. So I scarpered. Too dangerous for the likes of me, and I had enough to live on for many and many a day. Packed up my loot, my coin, left everything else behind. Fled to Skosglen, out past the hinterlands, nuzzled against the ocean's breast. Druids founded Skosglen, they say. Nothing to do with cities and stones, streets and men's laws. Don't know rightly if I believe that or not, even now. Whether the Druids founded it, or even if they existed. My whole life I only ever believed in whatever I could pinch and stash in a pocket. But a safe place for the likes of me, I thought. A new place for my old face. I stayed for a while, long enough to pick up the customs, the accents, and the lay of the land. And then I went farther, out to the end of the world, where the land broke against a churning sea. And then I went even farther. A little island just off the shore. Could barely see it with your naked eyes at sunup, if the mist weren't too fierce. Even now I can't recall the name of that island, and the name of the only town on it. A fishing village, with more boats than men, and a single alehouse to drown their misgivings. The people there were simple folk, simpler than me at any rate, which suited me just fine. They'd been on their piece of floating dirt for generations, and while they didn't take to newcomers all that well, they took to coin just fine. I spread some around and dug in a little hut just outside the main fishing village. A copse of trees and a brackish stream between me and the rest of the world. A strange coincidence of waterways kept the island in the thaw, when a place so far north should have been frozen over. Not that it was warm on the island, just warm enough. So I'd done it. I'd lived the dream of every rogue and free boat ever born. Saved up my loot, kept my head down, and got out while the getting was good. I was safe. Early on, I took to wandering a bit. I was restless in those early days, you see. Took years for me to learn to sleep at night and walk by day. Took just as long to stop looking over my shoulder. In my rambling around the island my first month there, I found an old temple a little deeper inland than most of the natives would dare go. To say it was in sad shape was to call the clouds white. It listed to one side, built atop swampy, broken land that could not bear its weight evenly. Its clapboard shingles had rotten from the salt air. built by someone who could not imagine the way the world corroded and corrupted even stalwart things. Townsfolk said it was haunted, said they were happy to let it molder and sink into the depths. Like I said before, I never believed in nothing that could haunt. I had enough fear from those of the flesh, and could not see borrowing any from the departed. But I needed a place to hide my stash, and it wouldn't do to hide it in my little hovel on the edge of town. My new neighbors were afraid to go near the old temple. One night, under the gibbous moon that could barely pierce the gloaming, I picked my careful way through the marshes and the reeds and the trees. The temple stood there, slick with swamp sweat and the piss of 1,000 herons and egrets. The inside was just as rotted and fetid as the outside. I pried up some floorboards near the crumbling altar and hid my stash there. It was mostly coin and jewels. I'd cashed in or pawned most of the artwork and such before fleeing, but there was still one thing that I held on to. From the Horadric archive job, a little extra piece I'd taken for myself in those dusty old archives. No one wanted to exchange coin for it, and truthfully, I'm not sure I would have parted with it for any sum, and I don't know why. There was nothing special about it. It was the length of my forearm, and the span of a goblet at its widest. A stone statue of a woman, arms raised. She was naked, but I'd seen enough women in the altogether that this wasn't what drew me to it. There was just something about it. It had a dull patina to it, its surface pitted by water and wear. The closer I looked at it, the more details I saw. Sharp teeth, like a wolf or a shark. Long, winding tresses that at first seemed matted and dirty, but with a good closed pair turned out to be intrinsically rendered strands of seaweed. It was ugly, and it was beautiful all at once. Maybe like my own soul. I came to realize that it was my good luck charm. I'd never reckoned by such things before, but I'd taken it from the archive and gotten away scot-free. Made it all the way to safety. No guard on my tail, no one following me. It was a token of my last job, and it kept me safe. I left it with my stash in the temple at first, but I kept thinking about it, almost like it called to me. So one moonless night, I went back to the temple and brought it to my hut. I slept better then. But the people in the village had odd notions about privacy, and thought little of entering someone's home unannounced. You'd think a thief would appreciate this quality, but I found it disconcerting. And besides, I was retired and I didn't want questions if anyone came to my abode, so I returned the idol to the temple. And then I missed it again. It was mine, and deserved it, no? Went back again, another moonless night, and set it up in the hut again. Went through this cycle many times, bringing it to me at peace, then slowly, over time, becoming more and more paranoid that someone would see it, that someone would try to steal it, what I'd honestly and rightfully taken. So I returned it to the temple in a safe spot next to my stash, until the next time I needed it again. This went on and on. I came to accept it. It wasn't the worst way to be safe. One day, as was my wont, I stood at the edge of the beach. A great pleasure of mine back then was standing at the waterline, where ocean kissed earth, and staring out at those great foaming, churning waves. I was a city boy, mind, until coming to this island. The largest body of water I'd seen was a bowl of soup. Cold, salt water ebbed and flowed, eating at the chilled, dark sand between my toes. Not far from me, a man launched his fishing line into the water over and over, catching nothing. I watched him idly, one eye on him, one eye on the horizon. Somewhere out there, a day or so by oar, was the mainland Skosklund, and somewhere deeper in, the dry steppes, and even the city. There was so much land and sea between us that a sound off to my left pulled me back to the present. The fisherman had cried out in surprise. His line was taut and vibrating like a bowstring on the knock. The rod bent almost double, and his heels dug into the wet-giving sand. I ran to him without a thought. In my younger days I'd run the other way, but I'd since learned to lend a hand, kept people from being suspicious. "It's fighting me!" he cried, feet slipping toward the brine. I threw my arms about his waist and dug in on the more solid ground behind him. Through his body I felt the struggle, the sea, the fish, the tide. He leaned into me, bracing against my body. I thought the rod would snap in half, but it tilted forward, then back, keeping the fish in play. I inched away from the tide, and he followed, and with a long, steady, dedicated rhythm of back and forth, and back some more, at last the fish exploded up from the salty water, as long as my leg, and then some. The sudden eruption caught me off guard. I let go of my companion and fell backward. He fell forward, landing close to the fish itself, which had beached and now flopped in the sand. I collapsed, unable to find purchase to rise. Everything around me was too soft, grainy and unstable. By the time I regained my footing, I saw the fisherman on his knees before the fish. I didn't know much about fish, even having lived on the island for a few years, but I knew this much. They were only supposed to have one mouth, and that mouth wasn't supposed to speak. Yet, as I closed in on him, I saw even clearer the first mouth situated in its usual place, gaped and gasping, seeking water, and the other, along its flank, filled with a dozen of needle-slender teeth and uttering words.
"Please for me. I'm cold."
I stared, aghast, but more possessed of my mind than the fisherman, who could only gawp at the thing. "Listen," the fisherman whispered, his jaw slack, eyes unblinking. I didn't want to listen. The sound of his voice was like bees stinging in my ears. As I said, I knew little about fish, but I knew an abomination when I saw one, and I knew too how to deal with abominations. I stomped on the damn thing, right in its center. My heel came down hard in the middle of another word, and the thing's viscera exploded out of its face and tail. There was a pulpit mash of dead fish beneath my heel, its guts twisting in the sand. The fisherman stared open-mouthed at me. No words passed between us. With our feet, we nudged and kicked the dead thing back into the water. That night I drank at the alehouse. Most of the local men did, and a few women too. There was little else to do in the village, especially if you had no family. In the city, I'd never tippled, too afraid to lose my edge, my vigilance. But in my years on the island, I'd learned to enjoy the ale old Thornval, brewed behind the alehouse from fermented kelp. My idol was at the temple, and I was starting to think I might need to go see her soon. It, of course. In a dark corner sat the fisherman I'd seen earlier in the day. From the look of him, he'd been swimming in drink for hours, but I noted only one tankard. According to Thornval, this was the only one he'd served. I went to the fisherman's table, back there in the dark. 10 words. 10 words. He was mumbling. 10 words of terror it spoke. He muttered under his breath. 8 words he had heard just himself, then the ones I'd heard too. Blasphemy. Engulf. They lacked power, spoken in a voice other than the fish's, but clearly their hold on him was strong. Then I noticed his tankard was still full. He'd had not a drop to drink, but his eyes bore the haunted and glassy sheen of a man in his cups. Suddenly, he threw the tankard at the wall and screamed, 10 words! 10 words of terror! They're coming! They're coming! Babbling nonsense now. His words inchoate and incompetent. He rose. Tears streamed down his face, and he began coughing, as though something had stuck in his craw. The patrons edged to the walls as the fisherman, now clawing at his throat, stumbling his way to the door and outside. I followed. Mist had rolled in, grey and needle cold. The fisherman collapsed to his knees, a few paces from the alehouse door, hand still at his throat, as though to choke himself. I approached, wary. The mad are a harm mostly to themselves, but in their throes can hurt those surrounding. And I had made a life out of avoiding hurt. He keened, long and high-pitched. I stepped closer. And then, As I watched, he dug his fingernails into the soft flesh of his throat. I froze there. Bubbles of blood welled up at the 10 points of his fingertips. A steamy hiss escaped his lips. I was helpless to stop him as he tore his throat wide open. I could only watch as his breath and his blood and his life erupted from him, and I could swear there was a satisfied smile upon his lips as he died. Couldn't sleep that night. I'd lived my life on the free side of the law and had avoided violence wherever I could. Bloodshed was not my forte. I only carried a dirk for jimmying open windows and jewelry boxes. I could hardly throw a punch. I couldn't stop thinking of his throat, of its yawning, endless gape, the ravaged vocal cords and the spill of blood. The morning brought a new surprise, this one less bloody, but more mysterious. Down at the shoreline, not far from where a pathetic streamlet joined the ocean, a misshapen dune had arisen overnight. It stood not quite as tall as a man and had the shape of a dome. Something too perfect about it rankled. It was made from sand, but seemed a blight on the beach. Unnatural. I didn't want to step near it, nor did anyone else, though for different reasons. "It's a message from the Druids," someone breathed. A murmur of agreement shuffled through the crowd. The Druids. The founders of Skosglen, if you believe the old stories. And my neighbors surely did. Founded Skosglen and, local pride insists, spent a moment just to the north to raise this very island up from the waters and the murk. Likely story. I'd more believe some demon had shit the place out. No one would go near the sacred dune for the fear of displeasing the Druids. Me? I stayed away because I'd learned long ago to keep my distance from mysteries and things that I didn't understand. Best way to stay alive. Everyone meandered away, back to the village, a prideful babble on their tongues. I stayed a moment longer, staring at the dune. Days later, again at the shore, I beheld a new and unbelievable sight. If not for the fact that others witnessed it too, I would have assumed that it had been a dream, that I fantasized it. Or that my mind, tired of decades of switchback thinking, had given up and begun that slow wandering toward dementia of the aged. But others were there. They saw it too. We saw it. And we heard it. The terns twisted above. Their tails tilted as they flew. When they cruised low and close to the water, when they flew low to snatch up a fish. You'll call me mad when I say it, but I saw it with my own eyes. As the terns closed on the surface, fish leapt from the water, opened their mouths, clamped hard on wing and leg and beak, and bore the terns down into the wet. I saw it myself. I saw the fish, leaping with bloodlust, dragging their prey into the water. A flurry of feathers flew, fell. The skin of the sea went white with them, and then red. Blood-soaked feathers drifted in on the tide. A harsh wind blew. "The Druids are angry!" someone cried, to a chorus of tearful agreement. I wondered if it could be, but I also wondered, what if this wasn't because someone was angry? What if this made someone glad? I woke that night to a perfect stillness, as though the silence had somehow stirred me from a perfect slumber. I waited, listening. And then when I needed to inhale again, I realized what had awakened me. A smell. The sea. The ocean's pleasant salt tinge had gone brackish and too pungent. From aroma to stench. I lit a candle, hoping the smell of the tallow would drown out the permeating scent of something bitter and rotting. But a candle could not ward off the unease that crept along my spine like a column of fire ants. I'd survived the city by obeying my gut, and now my gut cried out for escape. Was it time to go? I thought of my stash hidden in the old temple, of the substantial amount of coin still available to me, of the idol I had not held or beheld in so long. I had built a quiet, boring life for myself in this village, one I was loath to surrender. I held no superstitions, unlike the fools in the town who spoke increasingly of the druids and their return. But as people seemed to turn more and more towards the old ways, I knew it might become uncomfortable for me, inhospitable. The beach near the sand pile had become a moat of offerings to the druids, beseeching their favor and compassion. People noticed I hadn't made any offerings. No one had said anything, yet. I resolved to think more on it in the morning. I waited too long, for the next day the examiners came. I do not know who summoned them. It doesn't matter, I suppose. Someone spooked by the strange goings-on at the water, perhaps, who'd sent word for the mainland. First, I beheld them at a distance, 2 tall and strong figures, so unlike the islanders who were all stooped by age and lifetimes at the rod and the net. They entered the alehouse. I did not. Strangers. On the island. It could mean only one thing. I'd been found out. Somehow, the city guard had stalked me here. It took them years, but they had found me. My fears seemed justified moments later. I found a young boy near the alehouse and summoned him to me. "Boy, tell me, who are these strangers among us?"
"Other than you mean?"
he asked. "No, Sass, young crab," I told him. "Who are they?" He shrugged.
"They are examiners, from the Horadric archive."
And with those words, the Horadric archive, he drove a spear into my heart. They'd found me. I thanked the boy and returned to my hut. I would have to go, there could be no doubt about it. When the night fell, I would repair to the temple, gather my things. I could steal a boat, a small one, to be sure, all I could handle, and row to the mainland by morning's light. A knock at my door interrupted my planning. My heart thumped. The villagers rarely knocked. When they did, it was as they opened the door and cried out the "Ahoya!" greeting warning. But my door did not open. Another knock. I considered doing nothing. "Glaric!" It was an unfamiliar voice with a familiar accent. The inflections of a city dweller, the cultured tones of an educated man. I said nothing. "We were told the man called Glaric resides here. May we enter?" I had but one window, and there were 2 examiners. Obviously one was watching the window. To my surprise, they both stood at the door when I opened it. I could have gone for the window after all. To my further surprise, one of them was a woman, the heavy grey coat and men's trousers she wore obscuring this fact from afar. Her hair, the color of ginger, was tied back tightly, bare, unlike her companion, who wore a pointed cap. I always respected women who wore trousers. They are more practical than dresses and skirts. "Who are you? And how do you know my name?" I demanded. Better to attack than to be attacked. "I am Zoff," the man said, bowing slightly and somewhat reluctantly. "An examiner of the Horadric archive. My companion is—"
"I am Da'an," the woman interrupted, not bothering to bow. "Similarly associated with the archive, we were tutored in their ways abroad. We are from far beyond Istani."
"You've answered half my question," I said curtly. "Thornval in the alehouse gave us your name," said Zoff. "May we come in? It's cold out here." It is. The air had gone damp and chilly, misty. I wondered if they could taste the tang of the bitter sea air like I could. I allowed them in, then positioned myself by the door to facilitate a hasty exit if needed.
"I am told,"
Da'an said after glancing around my hovel,
"that you were with Stavrik."
"Who?" Zoff chimed in.
"The fisherman. The one who reeled in the—"
"Oh yes, I didn't know his name."
"Really? It's such a small island."
I usually keep to myself." They exchanged a glance.
"But you were with him." Da'an continued after a moment. When he caught the fish, the one with 2 mouths. I had been interrogated any number of times. Long experience had taught me that it's best to pretend to be helpful. Tell every truth that you can afford. It makes the lies go down easier.
Yes.
And it spoke. Stavrik told many others that it spoke.
10 words of terror, Zoff chimed in.
Did you hear these 10 words? Da'an asked.
This is why you're here?
I could scarcely believe my luck. They were not here for me at all.
Because of a fish?
A fish that spoke, Da'an snapped angrily.
Don't forget the 2 mouths, Zoff said, smirking.
And you've no strange desires after hearing this fish speak? Da'an asked. No urge to rip your own throat out? I coughed at that moment. Not for any reason related to their question, but rather because the stench of the sea had caught in my windpipe.
The air is getting worse, I muttered, clearing my throat. I myself smell nothing, Zoff commented. I have daubed under my nose a tincture of my own concoction, a solution of oil and peppermint and—
The fish, Da'an interrupted. Did it do anything else other than speak?
Only die,
I told her, and then explained how I had crushed it with my foot and kicked its carcasses into the sea. Do you still have that shoe? She asked. I blinked at her in confusion.
It's on my foot,
I told her. With a cry of triumph, she dropped to her knees and bade me lift my shoe, only to rise again, disappointed, at the discovery that she past days of sand and water had washed away any lingering gusts.
You'll have to forgive Da'an,
Zoff said, now leaning against the wall, arms crossed over his chest.
My companion believes there may be supernatural goings-on here in the village, and she's eager to find proof.
The fish! Don exploded. It was obviously a disagreement they had been having for some time. How can you doubt?
A mere freak of nature,
Zoff said smoothly.
No mouth, a misshaped set of side gills, widened by catching on the fisherman's hook. The words it spoke being nothing more than gasps, misheard by our friend here, and the one now deceased.
I do not think that to be the case, though now when he said it, I devotedly hoped it to be true. I had no stomach for magic or mysticism. The smell, Da'an demanded, gesturing toward me. He mentioned it, and everyone we've encountered says it's gotten worse.
No doubt some large fish, perhaps even a whale, died nearby. I suspect its corpse will bob into view any day now.
The sand pile, Da'an went on. The fish catching birds. With that, my stomach sank. There could be no rational explanation, only to the supernatural.
Equally explainable, Zoff said easily. The sand pile is, I admit, too regular to have been crafted by the tides, but I surmise it was formed and placed by human hands. A local youth pranking the spooked and frightened adults. As to the fish attacking the birds, a fluke of nature. We know that there are fish that can prey on other fish. We know, too, that some fish can survive a limited time on land. Is it so impossible to imagine a predator taking advantage of the proximity of new prey? Da'an stared at him for a long and silent moment.
You are insufferable, she said, and your hat is ridiculous.
What does my hat have to do with any of this? Zoff shouted.
He would have said more, but Da'an cut him off with a curt and sharp glare. One final question, she said to me, as Zoff folded his arms over his chest and fumed. Have you heard the bells of late?
Bells?
Zoff snored.
Bells.
They use bells, Da'an insisted.
Say the old witches' tales and superstitions, he retorted.
They? I wondered. My curiosity perked up. What could they mean? Who were they?
No bells, I said. There aren't even any on the island that I know of. The big fishing boats use drums to signal the shore.
Da'an stroked her jaw. The barman, Thornvalm. He told us there is an old temple with a belfry out in the swamps. My blood chilled at the mentioning of the temple. My stash. I knew the bell ropes had rotted through even before I got in there, but
And I suppose you want to investigate it? Zoff said.
They spoke as though I'd left the room. I'm sure someone can.
I can guide you there, I told her, hoping not to look too eager. I couldn't let them go with someone else. It would be too risky. By going with them, I could guide them away from my stash. The three of us were deep in the fetid murk in the inland swamps. It reminded me of the sewers back in the city. Dark and wet and rank places I fled to when needs drove. Once upon a time, I imagined there would have been a clean path from the town to the temple, but it had overgrown and vanished long before I had arrived here. Still, I knew the way. Following a briny twist that broke the land. It took us the better part of an hour to reach the temple. But at last I clawed a drapery of hanging mosses out of the way, and there it stood. The mist had thickened, needle-sharp and pungent. Heavy condensation blackened the boards of the temple.
Horadric architecture,
Dan said breathlessly.
Dates back to the early Druidic period. There would be a bell in the tower. It said that they used bells to...
For the love of Tyrael! Old tales and myths are hardly enough to...
Dan seethed. Myths can have teeth. They can bite.
Could they? Like every other gutter whelp in the city. I'd been raised on tales on the mysterious and magical, but I'd never paid them much mind. Ethereal goings-on were for others. I lived in a world of grim and crime. I didn't know who to believe. The Anne was forceful and bright, but wouldn't a mage, as Zoff clearly was to my eye, know the difference between true magic and happenstance? The Anne had walked ahead, fuming. I approached her and asked, "They? Who are they?" She said nothing for a moment as we picked our way through the undergrowth toward the temple. Then,
have you heard of the drowned, Glaric?
The drowned?
Creatures from the deep, servants of some ancient creature whose name we no longer know.
She paused, thinking, not to recollect. I knew she had all the facts on her lips. She was wondering how much to tell me.
Once they lived as we do,
she went on in a halting tone.
Men and women and children alike, innocent and guilty and in between. But then something reached out from the cold black seas and took them, turned them into something foul, undead, undying. A submariner of any deathless loyalty. Every so often we hear them, coming to the land to replenish their numbers, bringing the stench of rot and the strangeness of phenomena with them.
I stared dumbstruck. There seemed to be nothing to say. And then from behind us, Zoff laughed, a short, sharp blurt of mirth. My partner believes witches' tales, I'm afraid. She sees ghosts and ghouls around every corner, only behind the darkest corners. And then, to my surprise, she began to chant.
Speaking in waves, oh, the drowned will come upon the sea, kelp-kittled, brine blood, moon-mad and wet. Upon the sea the drowned will come, oh, the drowned speaking in waves. They are not to be trifled with, she said, her tone so dark and serious that even Zoff could not find it in him to laugh. He merely gazed upon the ruins in the marsh. We had gained the door. I led them inside and discovered a 6-inch deep pool of water across the entirety of the floor. We sloshed as we entered. Zoff made a gesture with his hands, and suddenly there was a pale ball of lightning floating above eye level. The Ant did not react, and Zoff obviously wanted me to, but I refused to satisfy him. The inside of the temple was as wrecked as the outside. The floorboards did not so much creak as bend at our tread. The altar had begun to sag from its waterlogged foundation. Water rose above my ankles. I kicked at it, a slick blackish spatter rising into the light from Zoff's magic. "This wasn't here before," I said, more to myself than to them. I hunkered down and scooped up some water, dipping my tongue into it. "Ugh! This is salt water, not marsh water or rain," I told him. "So?" Zoff spoke. The Ant was staring around the inside of the temple. "So, how did it get here from the ocean?" I asked. Zoff shorted. "How long have you lived here, Glaric?"
Don't you know about the tides? I knew a little of the tides, of course. Enough not to be dragged out to the sea by them, but not much else, he continued. Given how much this island sits in the sea, a strong enough tide could reverse that sad little creek we followed here, push seawater along that channel, right back here. I remembered then some talk in town recently. The moon and the sun in alignment. Highest tide in a century. Something like that. I was a trained scofflaw, and so I managed not to react when Dawn sloshed her way across the floor and trod directly over the spot where I'd hidden my stash. Zoff stayed at the doorway with me, not willing to wet his boots further, it seemed. The stairs to the bell tower are that way, I pointed. They were still in reasonable shape last time I was here. Reasonable? Zoff barked. Come along, you coward, Dawn grumbled, and led him away. I waited until the creak of stairs told me they were nearing the second story. It was torture, but it also gave my old thieves' eye time to adjust to the magicless dark. Then I quickly splashed through the water to the spot where I had concealed my treasure. The salt water had warped the board somewhat, so it was difficult to pry up the flooring, but I managed. Above me, I heard tread on creaking boards, still untouched by the flood. Zoff and Daan. Soon enough they would realize that the bells here were useless and would descend. Working quickly, I set aside the boards. More water gushed up from beneath. My leather sack of coins and gems lay nestled where I'd left it, its stout cords tied tightly shut. But there was no idol. I pawed at the water, staring it, feeling around, my fingers pleading to brush against the stone curves, but nothing. It was gone. I no longer cared who was right, Daan or Zoff. No longer cared whether it would be better or worse to have this isle assailed by magic or by simple logic. No, I lay awake that night pondering, not the mysteries of the sea, but rather, what had happened to my idol? Who could have taken it? And what sort of person would take the idol and leave behind a sack of coins and jewels worth more than the entire island? I'd managed to replace the flooring before Zoff and Daan returned, bickering and insulting each other, angry over the fruitless trek through the swamps and perilous climb up the rotting temple stairs, only to find a rusted-out bell that could not have sung a single note, even had its ropes been intact. They debated again the whole way back to the village. My head spun between their arguments. Had I really heard the fish speak? Was I going to become another superstitious islander, making offerings to druids I didn't really believe in, just in case? More importantly, what had happened to my idol? I itched with knowledge and ignorance. It was gone, and I didn't know how or where to find it. Maybe something magical was afoot. I thrashed against my thin sheet, twisting and turning in bed like a newborn. Nothing made sense. The world was topsy-turvy, and the only comfort I found was in the lulling background noise of the surf in the distance. The steady tidal thrum crash. And then I knew. I sat upright in the bed, shocked by the obviousness of it all. There was no magic. No drowned. Nothing supernatural at all. I knew where their idol had gone. So I went to retrieve it. It was damn near impossible to see. The fog had gotten worse since the sun had set, and there was no moon. Chips of light fell from the stars. I had no torch because I didn't want to be seen. My eyes soon picked up the slack. I trod lightly down the path from my hut to the beach, to the pile of sand like a great misshapen wart on the rough and rugged skin of the beach. The waves lapped at the shore. The tidal hush. I remembered what Zoff had said about the tides, about them washing up the creek bed to the temple. The sack of coins had been too heavy, but the idol must have been swept away, just let loose by the high tide, then dragged downstream by the low. Here, to the sand pile, or rather, to this spot, and then the sand had moved to cover it, to protect it. My feet brushed a path through the ring of offerings from the villagers, nudging aside cockles and reed-woven necklaces and seaweed garland, hesitant just a moment before touching the pile. One of my rules of thievery, Don't touch nothing you don't know won't touch back, but I had to have it. It was mine. I stole it right and proper. I began to dig into the cold sand. It was like burrs in my skin. Should have brought a shovel. But my hand served me well enough as I plowed through the pile, hurling fistfuls of sand behind me. Soon, I could feel it, calling to me. Soon. There, in the hazy starlight, I saw the dull glimmering of stone. I felt a wash of relief. I had it again. I would be safe again. I told you, Da'an. With effort, I wrenched myself away from the hole I'd gouged out of the pile. A few yards away stood Zoff and Da'an. I knew he was up to something, Zoff crowed. I knew there was something off about him. You disguise it well, Da'an told me, almost sadly. But to the trained ear, you sound like a city dweller. I'm far from the city, I told him, my tone light. Came here when I lost my wife to a gang of thugs. The lie came easily. I'd used variants of it before. No harm in a man taking a walk on the beach. And digging in the sand pile, Da'an asked, coming closer. What exactly are you digging for, Glaric? Does it have anything to do with whatever you got hidden in the old temple? I'm sure my face betrayed nothing. I've been shocked by the best, and never let it show. But Zoff, lingering farther from the waterline, chimed in. You're up to something out there. We heard you moving floorboards around when we were upstairs. Tell every truth that you can afford. Before Da'an could get to me, I reached into the hole and hauled out the idol, holding it aloft. You're right. I was hiding this, but it wasn't there anymore. At the sight of the idol, Da'an stopped dead in her tracks and gasped. Where did you get that? It was in the temple, I told her, evading the truth about its original location. It washed downstream. Put it down, she shrieked, her eyes wide, her expression horrified. Drop it where you stand! I glanced at it. The seaweed hair, the sharp teeth, the patina of green. For a moment, my vision went blurry, like sweat in your eyes, despite the bitter cold. It's just... I blinked away the blurriness as I stared at the idol. It seemed to have changed. It seemed older. And also cleaner. Have a care and put the damn thing down, Zoff said. He'd come closer, summoned by the fear in Da'an's voice. They were close to me now. It came here, Da'an said, each word trembling as it came out. And it made the fishes leap, and the sand monument, and... It's just washed down here, I told her, gripping it tightly. It was just an accident. An accident? Da'an yelled. There are no accidents, you fool! This has happened just as they desired. They drowned. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to say I didn't believe. But even Zoff looked ill as he stared at me. I'd been so sure that he was right all along, but now... My skin prickled with sudden heat where I touched the idol. I had to drop it, but I couldn't drop it. I had to. I wouldn't. Da'an rushed at me then. I raised the idol to strike her with it, but in that moment she tackled me, knocking me to the ground. The idol slipped from my hand as she bore me down. I managed to slip from her grasp, rolling in the sand before popping up a few feet away. She was still down, looking for purchase, the sand tripping her when she tried to rise. Stay where you are! Stay where you stand! Zoff was ways away from me, but he had begun gesturing with his hands, sparks flitting around his fingertips. I charged at him, grabbing his wrists and twisting as hard as I could, forcing him to stop. He punched me in the side. A flare of pain erupted. Hadn't been punched in a long time. I'd lost my tolerance for the surprise of it. I stumbled back and fell in the sand. Zoff loomed over me, but I lunged up and I froze in a half-crouch at what I saw. Not far away, just down the grade to the waterline, Da'an now held the idol, still down on her knees, but behind her, dark shrouded shapes emerged from the night-black sea. They had the form of men and women, but their flesh was tattered. their clothing rags clotted with strands of seaweed. Their eyes glittered like chips and polished obsidian. I tried to speak, but could only find the air to gasp. It was true. They were here. Da'an was right. Da'an had been right all along. The sound of the bells rang out, sour but clear on the night air. Some of the figures stepping out of the deep carried them, ringing them. The sound made Zov turn away from me, staring down the beach. "What?" he whispered. Before he could move, the figures were upon Da'an, who shouted out in terror. Zov froze in place. I froze in place. Behind me I heard a murmur. Islanders had come to the sound of the bells. Half of the village, it seemed like, drawn by the ringing and the chimming. "Go back!" I yelled. "Go back!" They didn't listen. They stared, silent. Did they think these were their precious druids? Or some punishment being visited on them by the demon of the deep? Did they even care which? At the waterline, 4 of the figures from the water held Da'an fast. 2 of them at her arms, 1 at her legs. The 4th held her head steady in sea-slick hands, forcing her to look at the idol. Zop was whispering, curses and prayers, I couldn't tell which. Either one seemed to make sense at this moment. "Soph!" Da'an cried in terror. "Soph!" It broke him from his reverie. And he stumbled. And his stumble ran down the sands to her. The things from the sea held her fast. They pushed her face closer to the idol. Her scream stabbed my heart. I never heard such a cry from a human throat. And still the bells chimmed. And still the islanders came, shuffling their feet along the sand. Da'an screamed again, her face closer to the idol. A sort of sickly light puddled in the air between her and the idol. As I watched, her eyes began to bleed. Something dark green and vicious wept from them. Zov stopped in his tracks. Da'an's eyes drooled the green ichor. It dribbled in clotted rivulets down her cheeks, clung to the curve of her jaw, dripping onto her clothes and the sand. She hissed and spat and turned those horrible, horrible eyes to her companion. "Now do you believe?" she cried, and laughed until her voice broke and became a grunting howl. She never spoke again. Soph screamed and stumbled backward, flinging sand in every direction as he tried to flee, but the figures from the waters were on him in a heartbeat. Their slimy and dead hands strong upon him. Silent, they dragged his screaming form toward the idol. Zoph began to keen in terror. High-pitched and childlike, more figures emerged from the water and scuttled up the sands like crabs toward the islanders, but none approached me. Though I stood within reach, just like the others. As I froze in place, still as my beloved idol who had caused all of this to happen, one of the creatures turned its head with slow purpose, staring up the slope of the beach at me. Its cracked lips parted, and it sizzled along, sibilant syllable. Its eyes found me, and I could not stare, but I could also not stop staring. I thought perhaps its mouth twisted upon into something like a smile, the joy of sharks and piranha, sharp teeth bared in ecstasy. And it tilted its head as though to acknowledge, as though, I thought perhaps, as though to thank me. I ran. I ran from the beach. I ran to the docks. I flung myself bodily into the first boat I saw, cast off its line, and rowed with all my might. I rode through the night, my breath hot and hard, puffing in clouds all around me. When morning's light glinted at the horizon, I took strength from the opening eye of the sun and heaved harder at my oars. On land, I ran again, ignoring my body's exhaustion. I had left my stash behind, my life's work, my treasure, and I did not even realize it until 2 full days later when I woke in a thicket covered in ants and raccoon shit. I thought of my stash no more. I brushed myself off, and then I ran more. Farther, higher. I ran until I came here, to the top of the mountain, to the farthest place from the sea I could find, where the waves did not crash, and there was no sand. No tides. I thought I'd run far enough, until I caught it the other night, a whiff of salt, and even now I smell it still, as you smell it, the salt air that will soon go brackish and bleak. They are coming, as the aunt foretold, so I have to run again. But here at the top of the world, there is nowhere left to run.